and welcome back to the Burning Hand of Friendship, a channel devoted to the relics of pop culture that scrambled our brains in the physical media that built the mythos of a new age. And I am your host, Friendo number 2. You remember me, the movie guy and the conscientious vampire. But today I am the music dude, and I thought it would be a fun time to go through some vinyl records. I know October is over, but I still have all these spooky soundtracks I pulled out for the spooky season in my DJ shelf. And most are my favorite spooky movies. So let us hang out and look at some spooky vinyl. But before we begin, please remember to bless that like button and tap subscribe to seal your fate among the initiated. So every spooky season, I start off with Alice Cooper's Constrictor from 1986, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Hint, I usually pair it with this banger, Dawkins' Dream Warrior, the theme song to the best Nightmare on Elm Street, if you ask me. And now I will reveal why I pair it with Alice. It's because we have He's Back, the man behind the mask, from Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Live, the first Jason movie I snuck into as a little teenager. And as a little metalhead, I have to say, it was a good time to be alive, the era of heavy metal and horror. But anyways, let's jump to Profondo Rosso, aka Deep Red, an iconic theme song by Goblin. And this 10-inch came in a box set of Claudio Simonetti along this Dario Argento opera soundtrack. And it came with Demons, which we will hit on later. And the box itself, it was put together in a very messy way. But it comes with a demon poster, and I got to meet Claudio Simonetti. So it's kind of special. And next we have these amazing compilations. If you're a DJ, it's Criminali, and these are compilations put together by David Neratani, the drummer for Italy's La Batteria. Check it out, because it's hard for me to explain how they sound, but they sound kind of like this compilation, because here he is tapping into the archive of Italy's Flipper Music, who put out very cool jazz fusion library music and soundtracks in the late 60s and 70s, and these compilations basically give you the vibe of a giallo, an Italo thriller, or a polizioteschi cinema, crime thrillers with a jazzy or proggy vibe. So, I highly, highly recommend this. And this I really don't play, it just puts me in the mood. It's one of my first Sesame Street records when I was a little kid. My mama got this for me. I even, checked out the songs I liked because I was a weirdo kid. But anyways, I love the Sesame Street monsters. They get me in the Halloween mood, and that's why it is here. I just wanted to show it off. And anyway, it's not a flex, but this one I need to show off. And if you're a Gen Xer or a elder millennial or a younger boomer, this is gonna hit. The Chilling Sounds of the Haunted House by Disney, usually played in a background of any Halloween party you would go as a little kid. Has spooky party games, and on top of that, it gives you spooky party hints. How to liven up your party with decorations and invitations. It's a party time, everyone. An essential record if you're throwing a Halloween party. Anyways, this next one is for the boomers. A famous monster speak. And I believe this was connected to the famous Monsters of Filmland magazine, a very popular magazine for young boys in the 1960s because it was all about the monsters. And here we have Frank and Drac, and they're chatting it up here, telling stories, and it's perfect for DJ sets where you need a transition. Frank will go, oh, and then you could throw in the beat. But anyway, Frank, Dracula, Universal Monsters, love them. And now we will move into my soundtrack cubbyhole. These were the ones I pulled out for this season, starting with Lucio Fulci's Horror and Thriller, and it's a very cool compilation of songs from his movies like A Lizard in the Woman's Skin, Manhattan Baby, House by the Cemetery, which I also have a full length, and Adored to Silence, the classics of his, people like Ennio Morricone, Fabio Frizzi, Walter Rizzati. If you like that jazz, fusion-y, prog rock vibe, this is the thing to get, that horror Italo vibe. And this is probably Jerry Goldsmith's spookiest soundtrack. The dissonance, the eternal tension, Alien almost sounds like an avant-garde classical piece by Durdi Ligeti or Edgar Varese, and I was very little when this came out, but I wanted the big alien action figure, but my mama would not get it for me because she thought it was too scary. But you know what? Not as scary as the soundtrack. But you know what is just as scary? The Altered State soundtrack by John Corigliano. And this is one of my favorite Ken Russell movies, and I had to pull it out because Criterion released it on the 4K, so I'm very excited, and I had to get into the mindset and get myself all nerve-wracked because again, this is another eternal tension soundtrack. There is no chill in the Altered States, it's only bad trips. Even the love song has a bit of dissonance in it, but you know what? I love it, okay? And now we move to something more modern. Barbarian Sound Studio, a Peter Strickland film with an original soundtrack by a broadcast, one of my all-time favorite bands. And unfortunately, the singer Trisha Keenan passed away before they completed this. But this is an interesting soundtrack, almost meta as it plays like library music for an Italian horror film, and the film takes place in an Italian horror studio. Coincidence? Anyway, it's definitely a vibe movie. Some hated it, but I liked it. Same goes for Beyond the Black Rainbow, but I think more people hated this one than Barbarian. But let me tell you this, the Sinoa Cave soundtrack is how you say a French kiss. It has that synth wave vibe, giving us a modern but retro flavored horror synth soundtrack way before Stranger Things. But this is definitely a vibe movie, and the ending disappoints, but I enjoyed the road to disappointment.
We invite you to join us.
The Bird with a Crystal Plumage, Dario Argento's first movie, and the music is composed by Ennio Morricone, the master himself. And I love this soundtrack, because you have a little bit of loungy, and then you have a little bit of spooky loungy, and then you get the high tension, you know what I'm saying? So it's perfect to chill with, and you won't be freaked out all the time. But anyways, I think it's the classiest of the Giallo soundtracks. Oh, and this was a favorite when I was a little teenager, The Boogeyman. And this was probably the first supernatural slasher I saw on the VHS, and it spooked me, but the soundtrack always left an impression. And for years I looked for the soundtrack, impossible to find an original, so I'm so glad they reissued this a few years back. But anyways, it's a very minimal synth horror soundtrack, almost like a John Carpenter, but minus the beats. The Burning, with an original soundtrack by Rick Wakeman from Yes. And I had this record before I even saw the movie. I didn't see the movie until Scream Factory released it on the Blu-ray. So I always thought this was cool because, it was Rick Wakeman doing a horror soundtrack. So to my surprise, a lot of Rick Wakeman fans hate this. And can't they not put this into context? That it is for a horror film, the album does meander because it's not supposed to be listened to like a Led Zeppelin record, It's supposed to be for the vibe, man, to get spooked, So chill out, Rick Wakeman fans. It's cool. He did a good job, in my opinion. And next, we have a few soundtracks for a cannibal movies, where the music is always better than the movie. But look, it's a John Saxon. He's been following me since my last video where I talk about the Cannibal Apocalypse 4K. But this is the 1980 soundtrack by Alessandro Blanksteiner. It is a modern reissue by Death Waltz. And this was probably the tamest of the cannibal movies, as these were a rite of passage to watch as a little teenager, like Faces of Death. And Gen X, we were the kings of edgelording before the internet. But unlike Apocalypse, I don't think I can rewatch this one. Umberto Lenzi's Cannibal Furrow, aka Make Them Die Slowly. I love the Paul Donati score, but the movie is too brutal to rewatch, and it has animal cruelty. A version did come out that cropped out some of those scenes, but the audio is intact, and I'd rather just listen to this cool Paul Donati Italo horror score without the violence. But the best soundtrack of this genre, in my opinion, is A Cannibal Holocaust. It's also probably the best of the cannibal movies, but again, I cannot rewatch. It as well has some animal cruelty, which the director denounced later on, but the music, superb, all due to Riz Ortolani, who is better known for his theme song More for the movie Mondo Cane, which won the Grammy in 1964. And this is a childhood favorite, Cat's Eye, an anthology of horror by Stephen King, with a cool score by Alan Silvestri, who makes a perfect 80s horror soundtrack, throwing in all the tropes with plenty of synths. But look, little Drew Barrymore, she's holding the cat we follow throughout the movie, witnessing the horrors he sees, hence the Cat's Eye. Genius, Mr. King. And this one is not so genius. It is a chud. It is about these beings living in the sewer, and it was one of the favorites of mine as a little teenager. One of the first horror VHS movies I saw. And the music is just as cool. Again, minimal synth horror from back in the day. You know, the stuff I like, I guess. And of course, I got the iconic Creep Show by John Harrison. And this is the European version. As you can see, there's some French. I don't speak any French, though. And, you know, it's hard to judge this record because I've heard it so many times. I've seen the movie so many times. You know, maybe it's a mid-soundtrack, but since it sparks so much nostalgia, I can't really judge it, you know, fairly. And The Dark Shadows is another one I cannot judge fairly because my mama was a big fan of the TV show, and I would watch the syndicated reruns with her. And you know what? I liked it. You know, Barnabas the vampire, and of course the werewolf. I don't think he showed up too many times, the werewolf, but whatever. The music is also very cool and chill, kind of loungy, and the movies are cool too. They kind of have like a Hammer film with a lot of quiche in it. And this is my favorite of the lesbian vampire movies, and probably the classiest, Daughters of Darkness from 1971, with a great score by Francois Duroubaix. And this is classic erotic horror, so don't kink shame me, as it has a lot of style, kinda gothic, but with a late 60s flair, just like the music. And the story is about a lady vampire and her thrall who rope in a couple, and sex and violence ensues, but with plenty of panache. And I have to give a nod to Music on Vinyl for releasing this, as the soundtrack was not available in any format, you know, up until 2018. And then next we have George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, aka Zombie, on Dagord Records from Italy. And this is from the year 2000, a reissue. It was a double dip for me, but I couldn't resist. The cover and this amazing looking gatefold. The zombies are breaking through. Let's go to the arcade and play some games. We have some time before we die. But this is an essential Goblin soundtrack, if you ask me. And I have to show this off too, because I mentioned it earlier. This is the double dip. The German pressing is the same music, but an original pressing. But look, you even have Goblin here on the center stage, which, you know, they don't even show you that on the repress. But anyways, it even sounds a little bit better than the repress. But the repress has an extra song. Demoni, aka Demons, probably Lamberto Bava's best movie, and this came in that box set that I showed you earlier in the video. But this is Claudio Simonetti by himself without Goblin, and this is the complete score, so there's no Motley Crue or Accept or Saxon, some of my favorite heavy metal bands that were in the soundtrack. But anyways, of course, I'm going to have Eraserhead for Halloween. I know it's not quite a Halloween movie, but it is a spooky movie. And you know, we no longer have David Lynch, so I had to pull it out. And I had to hear the Girl in the Radiator song. And look, I bought this for 99 cents. I don't want to rub it in, but I was very lucky in the 90s when I used to go to the thrift stores, and this was one of them. And this one is an underrated Tangerine Dream score. I absolutely love this score. And you know what? I like the movie. Some people didn't like Firestarter. I love the Firestarter. And again, you know, I feel like I grew up with a Drew Barrymore. She was like, you know, a little friend. I was around her same age, you know, so like I bonded with her, all right? A parasocial relationship occurred when I was a child with Drew Barrymore. I'm sorry. But the movie, cool. The music, cooler. That's all I got to say. And this is another childhood favorite, which I probably saw too young, and it probably traumatized me because I love it. I absolutely love it. And this horrible, cheesy soundtrack too. You know, too bad there's not more Brian Fidel who did the actual score You could get that on the CD, but the soundtrack, it's all the cheesy stuff. The J. Giles Band, who I hated Centerfold, but I love their Frightened Night song. And you have Sparks and other fun stuff. And of course, everyone needs to play Ghostbusters during the Halloween. You need the Ray Parker Jr. You could definitely skip The Boys Are Back in Town, but then you have the song Magic, and you have the Laura Branigan song. It's not a bad soundtrack. I like it. And next we have, oh yes, Goblin. And this was, I think it's a bootleg, to be honest with you, but it's one of the first Goblin records I bought at a record fair. And it sounds good, actually. And it's great for DJ gigs, so you don't have to bring all your expensive Goblin records. You could just bring one. Godzilla, the score by Akira Ifukube, a classic, of course, from 1954, but this is a modern repress from Death Waltz Records, but everyone needs Godzilla in their musical library. And of course, everyone needs a Halloween soundtrack for their Halloween spooky shelf music party. You know, I love the John Carpenter, Alan Howarth, music. It is so iconic. And I also have the cassette for the first movie. I don't have it on vinyl though, but I've had this since I was a little teenager, and I bought it with my lunch money, so it means a lot to me. But anyways, Halloween 2, I know it's not as good as part 1, but I dig it. And, even the theme song has a little bit of a different remix than the first version, but whatever. It's a very cool soundtrack. But you know what I like more than part 2? Part 3. And I can't tell you why. I think it's because the theme song even sounds a little bit spookier. But I like this reissue by a Death Waltz. I love it. It looks like a TV screen. It's what you see when you put on the mask and crazy stuff happens. But look at this. A very young John and a very young Alan making the spookiest, sexiest, scariest Halloween music ever. And next we have a Hellbound Hellraiser 2. And I know I already talked about Hellraiser in my last video, but as you know, I love this franchise up to the third movie. But the first movie and the second movie, that is super hot, a French kiss. And yes, the tape is from my high school era, and that is a flex. But the first 2 movies scared me and I wanted more, which is why you are such a disappointment, part 3. It was just too campy, kinda corny. I mean, I had fun, but then at least, Clive gave us something else, an adaptation to Cabal, aka Nightbreed, which the Danny Elfman score is low-key underrated, but certainly a different vibe from the darkness Christopher Young brings. I also need to mention the unreleased Coil soundtrack, which was released, but not as an official soundtrack, but worth pursuing if you're into spooky sounds, electronic experimentations, and or industrial music. And this was already kind of mentioned in the Lucio Fulci compilation, but this is Walter Rizzati's score for House by the Cemetery, a famous video nasty. And it definitely is a gross movie, but the soundtrack is very cool. It's spooky, very 80s. There's some synths, but there's also a little bit of prog rock bass in there and a little bit of jazz fusion, but they're mostly spooky. And this I think is a modern classic, at least for the 2010s, one of the best horror films. It follows, but the soundtrack by Death Piece, it's very cool, kind of synthwave, but very gritty, almost industrial, but not quite. I just think it worked very well with the movie and the score. That's another French kiss right there. I love you, It Follows. But not as much as I love Legend, a childhood favorite, a movie by Ridley Scott, and this is the soundtrack by Tangerine Dream. You also have a song by Brian Ferry, and Lord Darkness sings a couple of songs. But like I said, Tangerine Dream does most of the heavy lifting here, and it is far superior than the boring Jerry Goldsmith score for the international cut. But anyways, Darkness is the song that you play for the spooky season, and then you can play the fairy and unicorn music for the winter season. Let the Right One In, a modern-day vampire classic from the 2000s, and this is the score by Johann Soderquist, released on Death Waltz Records, one of their first releases. I remember that's how they caught my eye, but you know what, I was never a fan of their custom art. But anyways, I'm a big fan of the movie. I think it has heart, that there's a lot of warmth to a bloody vampire film. But anyways, if you've never seen it, highly recommend. The Lost Boys, and this is another childhood favorite, and I hung this record on my wall, which is why it has that scar on the top. But anyways, this is all the bangers. You have a Tim Capello, I Still Believe, a Lou Graham, Lost in the Shadows, Gerard McMahon, Cry Little Sisters. This is a must-have. Lost Highway, probably the spookiest of the David Lynch soundtracks. And this one was edited by Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails. He compiled it, but the music, you have Rammstein, Marilyn Manson, but a lot of Angelo Badalamenti under the supervision of David Lynch, of course. Very spooky, and this is the music on vinyl reissue, the only official reissue of this. I believe Simply Vinyl did the first vinyl release back in 1997, but this one I believe is from 2016. And this is a modern cult classic, Mandy, the film by Panos Cosmatos, the same crazy guy that brought Beyond the Black Rainbow. But the score this time is by Johan Johannesson, who unfortunately passed away right before the movie came out. But anyways, I love this score, and this was actually one of my favorite albums of 2018. It's kind of dark, kind of black metal-ish, but with synths, it's great. I love it. Michael Mann's Manhunter. And this was the first Hannibal Lecter story ever put to celluloid based on the Red Dragon book. And I love the soundtrack, with the exception of the first song by Prime Movers. It's a very cheesy song, but the rest of it is cool. The Shriek Back, the Reds, Michael Rubini. It's definitely Michael Mann's spookiest soundtrack, like a Haunted Miami Vice episode. And a warning, the next two album covers may be disturbing. And we start things off with a Maniac from a 1980 with a Jay Chataway score, a very cool 80s synth score. But the movie in itself, disturbing. And Joe Spinell does a very good job in not having any sandwiches in his picnic basket, because he does go a little crazy, and he does commit a lot of murder, and it's very gory. But next we have the remake from 2012, and this time Elijah Wood plays the Maniac. But the music, I think it's even cooler. It's by this guy called Rob. It's very synth-wave-ish, kind of dark wave synth-wave, almost like the Disaster Piece, but a little bit cleaner. Does that make any sense? I don't know anymore. But next we have, Midsommar. And this is really an Easter album, if you ask me, but I play this all year long. I really love the score, and I really enjoyed the film. And next we have Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire, with a score by Popol Vuh, a cool musical collective from Germany that was led by Florian Frick. And they were part of the krautrock scene, the psychedelia. And they did quite a few scores for Werner Herzog, and this one is quite good. And this one surprised me, The Only Lovers Left Alive, because I'm not a big Jim Jarmusch fan. I mean, I love Dead Man, but other than that, it's Only Lovers Left Alive. And the soundtrack is actually very cool. It's like a dark, shoegaze goth thing that you could groove to. But anyways, this is a very cool movie. I highly recommend if you have a boyfriend or girlfriend, a cute thing to watch together. And I discussed in length in my previous video haul this movie phenomena and how I fell in love with Jennifer Connelly when I was only 12, you vixen. But I adore the soundtrack. You have Claudio Simonetti, Iron Maiden, some Goblin, and some Andy Sex Gang if you want some goth rock. The only song that is missing in the French pressing is the Motorhead song, What Is Wrong With You French People? And next we have more Claudio Simonetti, and this was from the box set that I showed off earlier. And this is for the Dario Argento Giallo opera. And to be honest, I have not given this soundtrack a proper listen, so I'll come back with a proper review. And next we have Jerry Goldsmith, who I did talk smack about him when we mentioned Legend, but I did praise Alien. And The Poltergeist is also one of his best of the spooky soundtracks, a movie produced by Steven Spielberg and directed by Tobe Hooper that taught us all, please stop building houses on top of graveyards, people. And next we have Prince of Darkness, more John Carpenter and Alan Howarth. And honestly, this era of John Carpenter is my favorite. You even have actors from Big Trouble in Little China in this, so it feels like he had a little actors community, And then in the 90s, I don't know what happened to John, but the 80s was very, very good to Mr. Carpenter. And I love this movie, Reanimator by Stuart Gordon. I do love the score too. But the movie, just very important to me in my teenage years, again. Spooky, ridiculous, and Jeffrey Combs. He's just amazing. The Return of the Living Dead. And I didn't see this movie until my little teenager years because this came out when I was a kid. But the soundtrack really inspired my musical taste when I was in high school. It got me into the Cramps, the Damned, 45 Grave, the Flesh Eaters, the SOL, and even Rocky Erickson. That led me to 13th Floor Elevators, one of the classic bands of the 60s psychedelia scene. But anyways, Return of the Living Dead, a must-have for any horror soundtrack collector. And the same goes with Rosemary's Baby, with a score by Christopher Comida. And you know what? I've yet to open this. I found this sealed, an original copy sealed, and I tease myself every spooky season. Will I open it or will I sell it? And the same goes to Stranger Things. I have the cassette, so I haven't opened the vinyl. I don't know why. Maybe I will keep and maybe I will sell, but I will never sell this one. Suspiria by Dario Argento, and the soundtrack by Goblin, yet another Goblin soundtrack in my collection. But this is probably their best known, their most iconic one. The one that introduced me to Goblin and their weird world of prog rock and synthesizers. And I will also defend this one, the Tom York Suspiria from the remake. And some people didn't like the remake, but I like the remake. I believe it could live in the same universe, it's just a different story. But the soundtrack in itself, wow. Didn't expect that from Tom York. I'm not even a big fan, but the soundtrack, cool. And here is another movie we discussed in my previous video, Dario Argento's Tenebrae, with a score by Simonetti, Pignatelli, and Moranti, and of course those three were in Goblin, but this is more of a synth score. Even the title track sounds like an Italo disco song, which was even sampled by Justice for their club banger Phantom. And more John Carpenter with The Thing, but this time music composed by Ennio Morricone. And I've yet to listen to this, I'm gonna listen to it now that it's going to get a little bit colder, and I'm feeling like Kurt Russell where I don't trust anyone. And the best thing about the 1980s satanic panic movement was the birth of the heavy metal horror movie, and this one was the best. Trick or Treat with a hard rockin' soundtrack by Fast Away. But as a little teenager and as a little heavy metal kid, I completely related with the protagonist, Skippy from the TV show Growing Pains, because I was picked on as well for liking heavy metal music. And of course, I have more David Lynch, rest in peace, my prince. And this is the soundtrack to one of the last things he did, Twin Peaks: The Return. And this is the second chapter of the soundtrack where it compiles all the bands that showed up in the episodes, at the Bang Bang Bar. And, has a lot of different stuff like Eddie Vedder, but you have the Chromatics, and then you have Trent Reznor and Julie Cruz, of course. But then you also have ZZ Top, which kind of kills the mood, but I love ZZ Top. I was born in Texas, so I can't help it. Videodrome, now this is one of my favorite David Cronenberg movies, with a score composed by Howard Shore, a very cool electronic horror score. And of course we have the beautiful Deborah Harry in the movie, who I still love. I love you, Debbie Harry, please marry me. But anyways, I love this score, I love the movie, and of course I have it. And this is the best soundtrack of the vampire lesbian movies, Vampiros Lesbos, a movie by Jess Franco, so it's a very trashy movie. It has definitely a cult following, but the soundtrack in itself, though, it is amazing. It's by Manfred Hubler and Siegfried Schwab, so it's very jazzy and loungy. It's perfect for a sexadelic dance party. Anyways, I love the soundtrack. The movie, a little bit boring, but plenty of nudes. And of course, The Wicker Man. I showed this off in the last video, so, I already talked about this, but definitely one of my favorite horror films of the 1970s, and I love the soundtrack. Zombie 2 by Lucio Fulci. Fulci, and the score is by Fabio Frisi. And this is the European sequel to Dawn of the Dead. And here in the United States, though, it was just called The Zombie. But it is a very silly film. I love it, though. But, a zombie fighting a shark, come on, guys.